The city streets were quieter than usual that December. Snow had started falling softly, covering the sidewalks and rooftops in a thin, sparkling blanket. Christmas lights flickered from the shop windows, and cheerful music floated through the air. But inside a small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of town, Mrs. Lin felt a heavy weight pressing down on her heart. The apartment was cold despite the small heater she had managed to buy last month. The radiator coughed and wheezed, barely warming the tiny space, and the smell of damp lingered in the corners. For most families, this season was full of laughter, warmth, and joy. But for Mrs. Lin and her two children, it had become a reminder of what they had lost. Ever since her husband passed away suddenly 6 months ago, life had been an uphill battle. She had tried to remain strong for her children. But some nights, when they finally fell asleep, the exhaustion and sadness caught up with her. Her husband had always been her anchor, someone she could rely on when life became too much. Now, she felt like she was drifting in a vast ocean, trying to keep her children afloat without her partner's steady hands. Her children, May and little June, were only 7 and 4. They didn't fully understand the depth of their father's absence, but they sensed it in the quiet, in the empty chair at the dining table, in the way their mother sometimes paused mid-sentence, eyes misting over. May tried to be brave, helping her little brother zip up his coat or carrying small groceries when she could. June, in his innocence, asked questions every day, hoping for answers she sometimes couldn't give. As December progressed, Mrs. Lin felt the reality of their situation more acutely. They had no extended family nearby. Her parents lived across the ocean, and her husband's family had returned to China years ago. The money she earned from sewing at home barely covered rent and food. Presents, decorations, or a special Christmas meal seemed impossible. She worried constantly about how to make this holiday meaningful for her children, even though she had no idea how she could do so. On one particularly cold evening, Mrs. Lin sat at the tiny kitchen table, sipping a cup of warm tea and staring at the worn calendar pinned to the wall. She had marked off each passing day, hoping something good would happen, hoping for a sign that things might improve. The snow outside continued to fall, piling up on the window ledge, turning the world into a soft, white landscape. She listened to the muffled sounds of laughter and carols coming from the street below, and it hurt her heart to realize that her children would wake to an ordinary day, without presents, without cheer, and without the warmth of family around them. Her mind wandered to memories of past Christmases. She remembered when her husband would help May decorate the tree, carefully untangling strings of lights, placing ornaments just so, and laughing when June insisted on hanging the biggest ornament at the top. The aroma of roasted sweet potatoes, a tradition her husband loved, would fill the apartment. Those memories now felt like treasures and pangs of longing all at once. She wondered if her children would ever feel that kind of happiness again. That night, as May and June slept in the small bedroom, Mrs. Lin wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep warm. She thought about the other families she saw in the streets, mothers and fathers carrying gifts, children laughing with friends. She wondered why life had treated her so harshly, why misfortune had come so suddenly. But deep inside, she knew she couldn't give up. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for May and June. The next morning, Mrs. Lin bundled her children in the little coats she had patched and mended so many times. She tucked scarves around their necks, carefully adjusted their mittens, and helped June's tiny boots click against the icy steps. They had to go out to buy groceries. The pantry was nearly empty, and she didn't want her children to go hungry. As they stepped outside, the cold air bit at their cheeks, and clouds of breath formed little puffs in the air. May clutched her mother's hand tightly, while June waddled close behind, trying to keep up. Walking down the streets, Mrs. Lin tried to focus on the task at hand, but her eyes kept catching the festive decorations in the shop windows. Children with shiny coats and bright smiles pressed their noses against glass displays, pointing at toys and candies they wanted. The sight filled her with both warmth and sorrow. She wanted so badly to give her children that same joy, even if only for a moment. But reality reminded her that they couldn't afford such luxuries. By the time they reached the little grocery store, her hands were red from the cold, and May's face mirrored her mother's quiet determination. They picked up the essentials: bread, rice, some vegetables, and a small bag of oranges. Mrs. Lynn added a few small treats for the children, her mind telling her it wasn't enough, but her heart insisting it was something. Even the simplest gesture mattered. As they walked home, carrying the groceries, Mrs. Lynn thought about ways she could make the apartment feel festive despite the scarcity. Perhaps they could make paper snowflakes to hang on the windows, or bake a small cake together. She wanted to create magic out of nothing, to remind her children that even in hard times, there was hope. May noticed her mother's quiet planning and whispered, "It will be okay, Mama. We'll be fine." June nodded sleepily, too young to understand everything, but trusting in his mother's love completely. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Mrs. Lynn sat alone, looking at the tiny, dim light of a single candle she had placed on the windowsill. The snow continued to fall outside, muffling the world in a gentle hush. She whispered a prayer for strength, for courage, for a miracle to reach her family. She didn't know what form it might take, but she hoped, truly hoped, that somehow, this Christmas would not be just a reminder of loneliness and loss. She thought about the kindness of strangers she had seen before. How sometimes, a small gesture, a smile, a helping hand, a shared meal, could make the heaviest days feel lighter. Mrs. Lynn resolved to look for those moments, to find even the smallest sparks of warmth in a world that sometimes felt overwhelmingly cold. And though the weight of worry pressed on her shoulders, there was a quiet determination in her heart. She would do everything she could to protect her children, to make them feel safe, to fill their lives with moments of happiness, however fleeting. She knew the coming days would be difficult, but she also knew that hope, even in the smallest amounts, could carry a family through the darkest winters. As she blew out the candle and climbed into her worn but warm blanket, Mrs. Lynn held her children close in her thoughts, imagining their smiles, imagining laughter echoing through the tiny apartment. She whispered into the darkness, "We'll make it. Somehow, we'll make it." And though her voice trembled, there was a quiet strength in her promise, a strength that would carry her through the cold, the loneliness, and the uncertainty, until a new chapter of warmth and hope found its way to their door. The next morning, the snow had settled into a soft white blanket, making the streets shine under the weak winter sun. Mrs. Lynn bundled May and June carefully, making sure their scarves were snug and their hats covered their ears. She had decided to go out again, this time to run errands for the week, and perhaps, if luck allowed, to look for something small and special for Christmas. It wasn't much, but she wanted to make her children feel that the season still held warmth. Even if their circumstances were modest, the streets were quiet, except for the crunching sound of footsteps in the fresh snow and the occasional ringing of a distant bell from a shop. May held her mother's hand tightly, walking carefully on the slippery sidewalk, while little June waddled behind, occasionally stopping to kick a clump of snow, giggling at the tiny spray that flew into the air. Mrs. Lynn smiled faintly. The children's laughter was a small comfort against the backdrop of her worries. As they walked past a row of small shops and cafes, Mrs. Lynn noticed a group of people helping an elderly man carry groceries to his car. It reminded her that kindness could come in so many forms, sometimes when you least expect it. She hoped that somehow, some small gesture might touch her family's life this holiday. She didn't know how, but she held onto the thought like a lifeline. While passing near the edge of town, she saw a large ranch, its wooden fences partly covered in snow, and smoke rising gently from a chimney. It looked warm and inviting, almost like something out of a storybook. The thought made her heart ache. She had never known a place like that, where families could gather, and children could run freely, without fear of cold or hunger. As fate would have it, May tripped over a hidden patch of ice, just as they were passing the driveway. Mrs. Lynn caught her quickly, brushing snow from her daughter's coat. May's cheeks were red from the cold, and June's eyes were wide as he watched his sister stumble. In that moment, a man appeared from the ranch gate, walking briskly toward them. His boots crunched in the snow, and he carried a warm, concerned expression on his face. "Are you all right?" the man asked, stopping a few steps away. His voice was calm but firm, carrying a hint of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Lynn straightened herself, holding May's hand a little tighter. "Yes, thank you. She just slipped on the ice," she said softly, trying not to show the worry in her eyes. She didn't know this man, and she wasn't used to receiving help from strangers. The man looked at the children, noticing their small, patched coats and the nervous way they huddled close to their mother. He nodded slowly, as if understanding more than she was saying. "It's dangerous out here in the snow. You shouldn't be walking so close to the road," he said gently. "Would you like some help with your groceries?" "That bag looks heavy." Mrs. Lynn hesitated. Accepting help wasn't something she did often. Pride, mixed with a small glimmer of hope, made her pause. She didn't want to impose, but she also knew she couldn't carry all the groceries safely with the children in tow. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you. That would be very kind of you." The man smiled warmly and came closer, taking the bag from her hands. His strength was obvious, yet his movements were careful, so as not to jostle the groceries. May and June watched silently, curiosity lighting up their young faces. "Missus." Lynn felt a sense of relief she hadn't felt in weeks. For a brief moment, the world seemed a little less heavy. "I'm Walker," the man said, introducing himself as he adjusted the bag on his shoulder. "I live just over there at the ranch. You must be cold walking in this weather." He nodded toward the snow-covered fence, and Mrs. Lynn noticed the small hint of pride in his voice when he mentioned the ranch. "Where are you headed today?" Mrs. Lynn explained that she was trying to buy some groceries and a few supplies for the children. "It's a little difficult this year," she said softly, not wanting to burden him with too much. "I don't have much to offer, but I'm trying to make it feel like Christmas for them." Mr. Walker's expression softened. He glanced at May and June, who were watching the interaction quietly, and then back at Mrs. Lynn. "I can see you're trying very hard," he said. "It's not easy, especially when life decides to throw challenges at you all at once. Maybe you shouldn't have to face it alone." Mrs. Lynn blinked, surprised by the gentleness in his words. No one had spoken to her like that in months. A mix of caution and hope swirled inside her. Thank you," she murmured. She didn't know what he meant by facing it alone, but the sincerity in his eyes made her feel safe enough to listen. "I know it might seem sudden," Mr. Walker continued, "but if you ever need a warm place, even just for a short visit, my ranch is nearby. You and your children are welcome to come inside, get out of the cold, and rest." Mrs. Lynn's heart skipped a beat. A warm place. A simple invitation. Yet it felt like the possibility of something she hadn't dared to imagine for months. She glanced at May and June, who were looking at her expectantly, and saw their eyes brighten at the thought of shelter from the snow and cold. She wanted to say yes, but uncertainty and caution held her back. Maybe another time," she said softly, not wanting to seem too forward. She wasn't sure if it was safe to trust a stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. Mr. Walker nodded, as if he understood completely. "Of course. I just wanted to extend the invitation. Sometimes a warm fire and a meal can make the coldest day feel much lighter." He handed back the groceries carefully. "Take care of yourselves, and remember, you're not alone. There are people willing to help." Mrs. Lynn thanked him quietly. As she held May's hand and guided June along the snowy street, her mind raced. Could she trust him? Could this be the chance she had been hoping for, the miracle she had whispered for the night before? And yet, a small seed of hope began to take root inside her heart, a fragile but growing feeling that perhaps this Christmas would not be spent entirely in loneliness. The rest of the day passed slowly as they completed their errands. Mrs. Lynn found a few small treats for the children, a tiny box of candy and a couple of storybooks that she knew would spark joy. Nothing extravagant, but enough to see May's eyes light up and June's giggles fill the tiny apartment. When they returned home, the children ran to the small kitchen table to inspect their treasures. Their laughter was like music to her ears. And for the first time in weeks, Mrs. Lynn allowed herself to imagine a day that was brighter than yesterday. That evening, as snow continued to fall outside, Mrs. Lynn couldn't help but think of Mr. Walker's kind words. She had never felt such genuine concern from a stranger. Somehow, the simple act of noticing her struggle had made her feel seen. The idea of stepping into a warm home, of letting someone else share the burden, seemed both strange and comforting. She couldn't stop replaying the brief encounter in her mind. The way he had spoken to her children. The careful way he had carried her groceries. The quiet kindness in his eyes. It was more than help, it was respect and understanding, something she hadn't felt since her husband passed. A sense of curiosity began to mingle with her hope. Who was this man? Why had he extended such generosity without expecting anything in return? As she prepared the children for bed that night, she quietly whispered to herself, Maybe tomorrow, we can see if he really means it. May and June were already snuggled under their blankets, tired from the day's excitement. May hugged her small book tightly, while June clutched the tiny box of candy. Their soft breathing was steady and peaceful. And Mrs. Lynn felt a wave of love and protection wash over her. She sat by the window, watching the snow continue to fall, turning the world into a quiet, magical scene. The lights from the nearby houses flickered warmly, and in the distance, she could still see the smoke rising from the ranch chimney. Somehow, it felt like a beacon, a promise of warmth and kindness waiting just within reach. For the first time in weeks, Mrs. Lynn allowed herself to hope that perhaps, this Christmas, there might be a moment of joy for her children. Not a grand celebration, not lavish gifts, but the simple, human warmth of generosity, care, and companionship. The thought made her heart pound with cautious excitement. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not knowing what the coming days would bring, but trusting that if she followed this small glimmer of hope, something good might be waiting for them. That night, the city seemed a little less cold, a little less lonely, and Mrs. Lynn allowed herself to dream of what might happen if she dared to accept kindness. And deep in her heart, she felt the tiniest spark of possibility, one that could change her family's Christmas in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. The following morning, Mrs. Lynn woke with a mix of nerves and curiosity. The memory of Mr. Walker's kind invitation lingered in her mind. Could she really go? Was it safe for her and the children? But more than anything, she wanted to give May and June a moment of warmth, a break from the cold, lonely days they had been enduring. She looked over at the children, still asleep, their small faces peaceful in the dim morning light. Something inside her told her that today could be different. After a quick breakfast of simple rice and tea, she gently woke May and June, telling them they had a little adventure ahead. May's eyes widened with curiosity, and June immediately scrambled out of bed, rubbing his sleepy eyes, full of excitement at the idea of going somewhere new. Mrs. Lynn bundled them carefully, making sure their scarves and mittens were secure. She packed a few essentials into a small bag, some snacks, a blanket, and their favorite little toys. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a short visit. As they walked to the ranch, the snow crunched softly under their feet, and the cold air nipped at their noses. May held her mother's hand tightly, while June ran a few steps ahead, giggling at the snowflakes that landed on his hat. Mrs. Lynn felt a mix of apprehension and hope. She had never been inside the ranch, and the thought of meeting a stranger on such a personal level made her heart race. Yet, there was something about Mr. Walker's calm, kind presence that made her believe this could be a safe place. When they reached the gate, Mr. Walker was already there, waiting. His face lit up when he saw them approaching. "Good morning," he said warmly, extending a hand of welcome. "I'm glad you decided to come." Mrs. Lynn nodded, giving a small smile. "Thank you for letting us visit," she said softly. May and June clung to her sides, shy but curious. Mr. Walker knelt slightly to be at their level. "Don't worry," he said gently. "You're safe here. Come in and warm up first. I have some cocoa ready, and then you can look around." As they stepped onto the ranch, Mrs. Lynn was struck by how peaceful it felt. The snow-covered fields stretched out before them, dotted with grazing animals and tall, sturdy fences. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the wooden house, giving off a sense of warmth and comfort. Birds flitted near the trees, and the gentle sound of a distant stream added to the serene atmosphere. Mrs. Lynn felt a little of her tension melt away. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. Inside the house, the warmth was immediate and welcoming. A fire crackled in the large stone fireplace, and the smell of baked bread and cinnamon filled the air. Mr. Walker gestured for them to sit near the fire, handing May and June small mugs of cocoa with marshmallows floating on top. The children's eyes widened with delight as they took their first sips, the warmth spreading through their little bodies and filling them with happiness. "This is amazing," May whispered, her voice full of awe. June nodded eagerly, holding his mug with both hands and blowing carefully to cool the hot drink. Mrs. Lynn felt her heart swell with relief. Seeing her children smile like this, free from worry and cold, was worth more than anything she could have imagined. Mr. Walker moved about the kitchen, preparing simple snacks while making conversation. "Do you want to see the rest of the ranch after you've warmed up?" he asked. "There's a barn with animals, a small garden, and even a little pond. You can feed the chickens or watch the horses. I think you might enjoy it." May nodded enthusiastically, and June squealed in excitement. Mrs. Lynn felt a little nervous. She didn't want the children to get too cold or overwhelmed, but she saw the genuine joy on their faces and realized that moments like this were exactly what they needed. "That would be wonderful," she said softly. After finishing their cocoa and snacks, Mr. Walker led them outside. The ranch seemed even more magical in the daylight, with sunlight sparkling off the snow. The children ran ahead, their laughter echoing across the fields. May stopped to admire a small group of chickens pecking in the snow, while June tried to imitate the clucking sounds they made. Mrs. Lynn followed slowly, smiling as she watched the children's delight. The horses in the barn were large and gentle. Mr. Walker showed May and June how to feed them safely, letting them hold out small handfuls of oats. May's eyes lit up when a brown horse gently nuzzled her hand, and June squealed with delight when a smaller pony nibbled from his palm. Mrs. Lynn laughed quietly, a sound she hadn't heard herself make in weeks. The simple joys of the animals, the warmth of the sun, and the kindness of Mr. Walker combined to create a moment of pure happiness. After the barn, they explored the garden and pond. The snow had coated the plants in a delicate white layer, and the children marveled at how beautiful the winter landscape looked. Mr. Walker showed them the pond, where ducks swam in a small, unfrozen section. May and June giggled as the ducks quacked and splashed in the water. Mrs. Lynn felt a quiet sense of gratitude. She had never imagined her children experiencing such freedom and wonder in months. As the afternoon approached, they returned to the house. Mr. Walker suggested they prepare a small Christmas activity. He had a few decorations stored away, and with some help, they hung paper snowflakes on the windows and small ornaments on a modest tree in the corner. May and June were thrilled, and Mrs. Lynn felt a sense of accomplishment. The room now looked festive, cozy, and alive with the children's laughter. Mr. Walker offered to prepare a simple Christmas dinner, and while he cooked, he shared stories of past holidays at the ranch. He spoke of family traditions, of winter celebrations, and of times when the ranch had been a gathering place for neighbors and friends. Mrs. Lynn listened quietly, feeling a connection to this man who had opened his home and his heart without expecting anything in return. She realized that kindness could come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes strangers could become a lifeline in the hardest times. Dinner was simple but delicious. They ate together, sharing stories and laughter. May and June were enchanted by the experience, asking questions and marveling at every small detail. Mrs. Lynn felt a sense of warmth she hadn't felt since her husband's passing. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to relax, to enjoy the company, and to believe that her children could have a moment of joy and normalcy, even in the midst of hardship. After dinner, Mr. Walker suggested they play a small game by the fireplace. He had a set of wooden blocks, and together, they built towers and little houses. June giggled as May knocked down the towers, and Mrs. Lin joined in the fun, laughing quietly at their antics. The room was filled with warmth, light, and laughter, the kind that makes memories unforgettable. As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Lin realized that her children had experienced something truly special. They had been safe, happy, and cared for in a way she hadn't imagined possible. She watched May and June snuggling under a blanket by the fire, their eyes heavy with sleep but shining with excitement from the day's adventures. Her heart was full of gratitude. Mr. Walker knelt beside her and spoke gently. "You don't have to go home right away. If you'd like, you can stay a little longer, just to rest. I want you and your children to feel safe and comfortable." Mrs. Lin hesitated, then nodded. The thought of letting her children enjoy this warmth, this kindness, just a little longer, was too precious to refuse. As she sat quietly, watching the children drift into sleep, Mrs. Lin felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The kindness of a stranger had given them a day filled with joy, laughter, and warmth. The small ranch, the animals, the decorations, and the firelight had created a sanctuary, a place where hope could grow, even in the midst of hardship. That night, as Mrs. Lin held May and June close, she whispered softly, "Thank you." She didn't need to say it aloud to Mr. Walker. She knew he would understand. His simple act of generosity had given her children a memory they would carry forever, and it had restored a sense of faith in humanity that she had feared was lost. She realized that Christmas was not about extravagant gifts or lavish celebrations, but about the warmth, care, and love shared between people. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Lin felt that her family could experience happiness again, even if it was just for a single day. The spark of hope planted by Mr. Walker's kindness had grown into a gentle flame, promising that brighter days could follow even the coldest winters. As she closed her eyes that night, Mrs. Lin dreamed of a future where her children could smile freely, where they could experience joy and security, and where the kindness of strangers could become the foundation for new beginnings. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and light, she knew that this Christmas had already become unforgettable, a memory of love, generosity, and hope that would stay with her family forever. The next morning, the sun shone brighter than it had in weeks, sparkling off the snow-covered fields. Mrs. Lin woke early, careful not to disturb May and June, who were still asleep under the warm blankets. She looked around the cozy room at the ranch, noticing details she had not before: the small wooden figurines on the shelf, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the soft smell of pine from the little tree they had decorated the day before. A sense of calm settled over her, a rare feeling she hadn't experienced since her husband passed. She watched her children sleeping peacefully and felt a quiet gratitude for the kindness that had brought them here. It was hard to believe that just a day ago, they had been huddled in their cold apartment, worried about a Christmas with nothing. Now, they had warmth, safety, and laughter. For the first time in months, Mrs. Lin allowed herself to imagine that life could offer moments of happiness again. When May and June finally woke, their faces lit up as they remembered where they were. They rushed to the windows to see the snow glisten in the morning light, and squealed with excitement at the thought of more adventures. Mrs. Lin smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. She watched as her children explored the room, touching the ornaments, laughing, and sharing small jokes with each other. Mr. Walker appeared in the doorway with a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well. There's a little surprise waiting for you outside if you're ready." The children immediately ran to him, their eyes wide with curiosity. May looked at her mother, then back at Mr. Walker, and asked, "What kind of surprise?" "You'll see," he said with a wink. "But first, breakfast. You can't start an adventure on an empty stomach." Breakfast was simple but hearty. Fresh bread, eggs, and warm tea filled the kitchen with comforting aromas. The children ate eagerly, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the fireplace. Mrs. Lynn felt a quiet joy, a feeling she hadn't known in months. She noticed how relaxed her children were, how safe they seemed, and it reminded her that kindness could have a ripple effect, touching hearts in ways that could not be measured. After breakfast, Mr. Walker led them outside. The surprise he had promised revealed itself as they stepped onto the ranch yard. A small wooden sleigh sat near the barn, decorated with garlands and a few simple ribbons. Horses, gentle and patient, were harnessed and ready. May and June's eyes sparkled as they realized that they were going to ride the sleigh through the snow-covered fields. Their excitement was contagious, and even Mrs. Lynn couldn't suppress a small laugh as June clutched his mother's hand tightly, bouncing on his toes. The ride through the fields was magical. The sound of hooves crunching in the snow, the crisp winter air, and the sight of endless white fields under the morning sun created a feeling of wonder. May pointed at the distant trees, noticing how the snow hung like delicate lace from their branches. June laughed as the sleigh bumped slightly over the uneven ground, and Mrs. Lynn felt her heart lift at their joy. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to fully enjoy the moment without worrying about what came next. After the sleigh ride, Mr. Walker led them to a small barn where the children could feed and care for the animals. May and June delighted in brushing the horses, feeding the goats, and scattering grain for the chickens. Mrs. Lynn watched, feeling a mix of pride and relief. Her children were learning about patience, care, and responsibility. And at the same time, they were experiencing simple happiness, something she had feared they would miss entirely. As the morning turned into afternoon, Mr. Walker suggested they prepare a small Christmas celebration in the main room of the house. He brought out a few additional decorations, some simple candles, and a few homemade ornaments he had kept from previous years. Together, they decorated the room, with May carefully placing ornaments on the little tree, and June clapping his hands every time he hung a decoration successfully. Mrs. Lynn joined in, her hands shaking slightly with excitement and gratitude. The room transformed into a warm, festive space, filled with light and laughter. When it came time for a small meal, Mr. Walker invited the children to help. They made simple sandwiches, arranged fruits on a plate, and even helped stir a small pot of warm soup. The children were delighted to contribute, and Mrs. Lynn watched with pride as they worked together, laughing and learning. For the first time, she felt that her children were truly experiencing a family-like atmosphere again, even if it wasn't the family they had lost. After lunch, they settled by the fireplace, the room glowing with warmth. Mr. Walker brought out a small book of stories and read aloud, his voice calm and soothing. May and June listened intently, occasionally asking questions or pointing at illustrations. Mrs. Lynn sat nearby, holding a blanket around her shoulders, and felt the quiet magic of the moment. There was a sense of belonging here, a feeling of being cared for that she hadn't known for months. As the afternoon waned, Mrs. Lynn found herself speaking quietly with Mr. Walker. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You've given my children and me something I didn't think we could have this year. Joy, warmth, and hope." Mr. Walker shook his head gently. "You don't need to thank me," he said kindly. "Sometimes, people just need a place to feel safe, a place where they can breathe and laugh again. That's all I want for you and your children. You've been through a lot, and it's time for a little peace." Mrs. Lynn felt tears prick her eyes. She realized that this man, a stranger who had taken notice of her family's struggle, had given them far more than a place to stay. He had given them dignity, kindness, and a renewed sense of hope. She thought about the lonely nights in their apartment, the endless worry, and the fear of being forgotten by the world. Now, those feelings seemed lighter, softened by the warmth and generosity she had encountered. As the day drew to a close, Mr. Walker suggested they take one last walk around the ranch. The children held their mother's hands tightly, walking slowly as they admired the snow-covered fields and the animals settling in for the night. May looked up at her mother and whispered, "Mama, can we come back here next Christmas?" Mrs. Lynn smiled, feeling a deep warmth in her chest. "I hope so, May. We can try." They returned inside as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the room. Mr. Walker helped Mrs. Lynn prepare a simple, cozy dinner, and they ate together, enjoying the quiet peace of the evening. The children were tired but happy, their faces flushed from the day's excitement. Mrs. Lynn held them close as they drifted off to sleep, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. That night, as she sat by the fireplace, Mrs. Lynn reflected on the events of the past few days. She realized that kindness could come from the most unexpected places, and that even strangers could become anchors in times of need. The ranch had given her children something she had feared they would never have again: joy, laughter, and the sense of being cared for. She thought about the future and felt a renewed sense of hope. Life would still have challenges, and she knew the days ahead would not always be easy. But she had learned that even small acts of kindness could create ripples, transforming hearts and lives in ways that were impossible to measure. Her children had experienced a Christmas filled with warmth and joy, and she herself had found a sense of connection and belonging that she had feared was lost forever. As she drifted off to sleep, Mrs. Lynn whispered quietly to herself, "Thank you. Not just to Mr. Walker, but to the world that had allowed this moment to happen, to the kindness that had reached her family when they needed it most." She held May and June close, feeling their steady breathing and soft warmth, and knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had been given a gift far greater than any material thing. A gift of hope, love, and human connection. In the following days, Mrs. Lynn and her children continued to visit the ranch. Each visit brought new experiences, new lessons, and more laughter. May and June grew more confident, learning about animals, nature, and the joy of simple pleasures. Mrs. Lynn felt her heart lighten, realizing that she was not alone, and that even in the darkest seasons, there could be light. By the time Christmas morning arrived, Mrs. Lynn's small apartment no longer felt like a place of loneliness. She decorated the tiny space with paper snowflakes and ornaments from the ranch, carrying a little warmth back with her. The children's laughter filled the rooms as they played together, and Mrs. Lynn felt a quiet, enduring happiness settle into her heart. She thought about the man who had opened his home and heart to them, and she realized that Christmas was not about gifts or grand celebrations. It was about compassion, generosity, and the simple joy of being seen and cared for. That year, Mrs. Lynn, May, and June experienced a Christmas they would never forget. One that reminded them that even in hardship, there was hope, and even strangers could bring light into lives that had felt dark for far too long. And in that realization, Mrs. Lynn knew that her family had been given more than a day of joy. They had been given a new beginning, a promise that kindness and warmth could be found, even in the most unexpected places, and that love, in all its forms, had the power to heal hearts and transform lives forever.